don't know, 12, 14, 15 years, something like that. It's been tremendous to watch him. So many that I've seen over the years, beginning as a student. Some 15 years ago, it was in the THM program at Dallas Seminary that he went through the doctoral program at Dallas Seminary. And following that, he came to Houston, where he teaches at the College of Biblical Studies and is also the senior pastor at Sugar Land Bible Church. We are pleased to have him. He also has a law degree, so he combines these two specialties of a law or legal background along with his tremendous skills as an exegete and in theology. So we always look forward to his presentation. So I'm going to turn this over to Andy.
Do I need to turn this on? Okay. All right. Y'all hear me? No. Be a short presentation. There we go. Well, if we could take our Bibles and open them to the book of Isaiah, chapter 33 and verse 22. Somebody told me once that every time you get up and speak, tell people to open their Bible to a passage, because that establishes authority. The problem is this presentation has nothing to do with the Bible, at least directly. Why did I have you turn to Isaiah 33:22? I don't know, but I'm going to try to tie it in at some point. And I'm just following the tradition that's been handed down to me. Isaiah 33:22. One quick announcement is at Sugar Land Bible Church, October 5th, 6th, and 7th, that weekend, we have Randall Price booked to come to a conference for us. And Randall Price is well known being an expert on Noah's Ark and the temple and the tabernacle. So we don't have any advertisements yet because it's a little early, but keep your eye on our website, www.slbc.org, and looking forward to that. Anyway, the title of this session is The Separation of Church and State, the Big Lie. And I shared this title with somebody, and they say, can't you be a little bit more nice about it? I mean, why do you have to call it a big lie? The reason I call it a big lie is because it is a big lie, as I'll try to explain. I first became interested in the separation of church and state when I was a new Christian, about 1983. I was very excited about the Lord, having just come to Christ, and I wanted to start a high school Bible study on our campus. And I went into the principal's office to ask him, could we do that? And he kind of looked at me like, what planet did you just fall off of? Don't you know that there's a strict wall of separation of church and state in this country? Now, that was 83. There have been some legal decisions that have helped in a scenario like that subsequent, but I was just a 16-year-old. I didn't know any better. So I thought that the country was built on a strict wall of separation between church and state. So I went home and pulled out a copy of my Constitution, and you know what? I never found that phrase anywhere. So where did this phrase come from? I don't think we can really intelligently talk to people about this. I don't think we can write to the newspaper. I don't think we can dialogue with our neighbor. I don't think that we could call a radio show, for example, and have an intelligent comment to say about it unless we understand a little bit of history. So I start off here with this quote by Thomas Jefferson, who warned that the Constitution could become a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form that they please. And that's the reason I start off with that quote, is I believe that this separation of church and state idea follows that very judicial philosophy that Thomas Jefferson warned about. So the separation of church and state is probably a term that is used by more people and more politicians and more legal philosophers to secularize America than in any other single expression. Anytime someone wants to ban a manger scene on the courthouse steps, or ban scientific creationism from being taught in public schools alongside evolution, or ban a posting of the Ten Commandments on the schoolhouse wall, or ban teacher-led prayer and Bible study, they always quote this phrase, the strict wall of separation between church and state. Now, before we get into this, let me just explain real quickly by way of qualification that I believe in separate sovereigns for church and state because I see that in the Scripture. The church has one function, to fulfill the Great Commission. The state has another function, to restrain evil. So I'm not arguing here for a theocracy. For example, in Islam, under Sharia law, there's a complete merger of church and state. So in this conference, we are premillennialists. That means we believe that we're not in the kingdom now. As my friend Tommy Ice in the back likes to say, if this is the kingdom, I must be living in the ghetto section of town. But the kingdom is yet future, and there won't be a complete merger of church and state until the Lord Jesus Christ reigns from David's throne. Now, having said that, though, what has happened is people have used this expression, separation between church and state, to ban Christian influence from government. And essentially what they're saying is the Christian worldview can have absolutely no say regarding how the government functions or is run because of a strict wall of separation between church and state. So when did this whole thing begin? Well, we really have to go back to two decisions that were made, one in 1962 called Engel versus Vitale, and the second one in 1963 called Abington Township versus Shemp. The issue in the Engel case involved a New York school district, and here the kids were reciting a non-compulsory, voluntary prayer that you could opt out of. It was about 22 words. It was very innocuous. It was very non-denominational, and it took about 10 seconds to utter. And this is what the prayer said. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee. We beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That's really jihadist stuff, isn't it? But for the first time in American history, the Supreme Court took an expression and used it to ban that long-standing practice, saying that somehow that prayer is unconstitutional. And then there was a parallel case that came down, 1963, Abington Township versus Shemp. This involved Bible reading. The reading of the Bible by a teacher, actually it was a student, was voluntary. The student could read from any version of his choice in front of the class. No instruction was given. No commentary was given. No sermons were preached. And once again, the Supreme Court used this expression, the strict wall of separation between church and state, to ban that practice, which had been long-standing in America. And I think if we could somehow resurrect from the dead all of our founding fathers and have them look at this country and what's happened to it, they would be completely shocked at some of these decisions. Because what I'd like to share with you are basically 9 reasons why the modern judicial use of separation between church and state is really out of harmony and out of whack with our founding of America. So here are the 9 that we're going to briefly walk through this morning. And you should have a handout that lists those for you. There's a paper also on the disc where I obviously go into detail on this. But let's go ahead and start off with reason number 1. This is the first of the 9. Why is this doctrine of a strict wall of separation between church and state out of harmony with the founding and origins of America? Reason number 1. When the court applied this doctrine, they read words into the First Amendment that simply are not there. The phrase, strict wall of separation between church and state, never appears in the First Amendment. Yet the Ingle Court and the Schempp Court based their rulings on this phrase that supposedly shows up in the First Amendment. So let's look at the First Amendment and see what it actually says. It says, Congress, that's an important word, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So what you see in the First Amendment are two clauses. The first clause is called the Establishment Clause. And the second clause is called the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause, as I'll try to show you, was designed to show people that America is not a theocracy. The Establishment Clause was designed to set forth the idea that denominational concepts have no place in public life. In other words, our founders didn't want a Baptist country, a Presbyterian country, a Methodist country, Episcopalian country. But they had no problems, as I'll show you, with the trans-denominational generic concepts of Christianity that go throughout all Christian denominations. And then you have the second clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and that prevents the government from interfering with religious practices. And so as you look at this First Amendment very carefully, you don't see the word strict, you don't see the word wall, you don't see the word separation, you don't see the word church, and you don't see the word state. Other than that, you're probably pretty close. By the way, I do find it in the Constitution of the former Soviet Union, an atheistic country. It says, in order to ensure citizens' freedom of conscience, the church in the USSR is separated from the state. I see it there, but I don't see it clearly in our own First Amendment. So where in the world did this phrase come from? How did it reach a point where it exerts so much power over the thinking of people? Well, if you study the history on it, and it's very interesting, the phrase comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. And so when the Ingle and Schempp courts used this doctrine, they essentially quoted that particular letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. Now, it's strange that the court would rely upon this letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. First of all, the letter was written in 1802, more than 10 years after the Constitution was adopted. Secondly, Thomas Jefferson, this came up in some of the teachings yesterday, Thomas Jefferson wasn't even present during the time when our Constitution was adopted. He was in France. Thomas Jefferson writes, one passage in the paper you enclosed to me must be corrected. It is the following. And I'll say it was yourself more than any other individual that planned and established it, i.e. the Constitution. I was in Europe when the Constitution was planned and never saw it till after it was established. So the phrase simply does not show up in the First Amendment. In fact, one judge commented on this. He says this, much has been written in recent years concerning Thomas Jefferson's reference in 1802 to a wall of separation between church and state. It has received so much attention that one would almost think at times it is to be found somewhere in our Constitution. Second problem with the modern judicial use of separation between church and state is Jefferson's use of the phrase in the 1802 letter, I believe, is totally taken out of context. And the reason for that is Thomas Jefferson himself did not oppose trans-denominational generic principles of Christianity in public life. After all, it was Thomas Jefferson who signed legislation involving a missionary or a minister who was supported from the public treasury, tax money, to evangelize the Indians. Stephen Mansfield puts it this way. Stephen Mansfield is a historian that looks into these things. He says, it was Jefferson, after all, who approved funds for evangelizing Native Americans. It was Jefferson who attended a church on federal property for most of his administration. He approved of still other churches on federal property. And even, now catch this, even ordered the Marine Band to play in his church. Could you imagine the chaos that would happen? I don't really know if I want the current president to order the Marine Band from Reverend Wright's church to play, but Thomas Jefferson really had no real problem with this. Of course, Thomas Jefferson, as we all know, is the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, which uses expressions related to God all of the time. He talks about the laws of nature and nature's God. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are evolved equally. I'm sorry, I misread that. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. When I was going through school, what they taught me was these are deistic expressions. Read what Gary Amos says. I have him quoted in the paper, I believe. He traces these things not back to deism, but to statements that Paul made in Romans chapter 1. So are we to all of a sudden believe that the very Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of, suddenly became unconstitutional in 1802? It seems a little strange, doesn't it? Here is the actual expression that Thomas Jefferson used in this 1802 letter. Now, when you look at the context of it, it's very clear that he is assuring the Danbury Baptists that the government would not interfere with their religious practices. And he was not making any type of statement in this particular letter regarding whether Christianity should be removed from the public square. So when Jefferson used the phrase, he applied it to the Free Exercise Clause. He never applied it to the Establishment Clause. And so that traditionally is how the judiciary has understood this expression. The first time it appears in a Supreme Court opinion is Reynolds versus United States in 1878. And there, in that case, you clearly see the expression relating to the Free Exercise Clause, not the Establishment Clause. So reason number 2 is Jefferson's use of this phrase when the court cites it is out of context. What are our 3 rules of Bible interpretation? Context, context, context. Well, we can apply that to the legal system, can't we? Looking at things in context. A third problem with the modern judicial use of separation between church and state is number 3, the court ignored the legislative activities of those who authored the First Amendment. The Founding Fathers never opposed public expressions of Christianity in government. Now, how can I know that with certainty? You can know that because one of the ways to determine the original intent of a law is to look at the behavior of the legislature that passed that law. Look at the same people prior to the law being passed and their activities, and the same people that are in the same legislature that helped pass that law just after the law was passed. And so that helps us, in other words, in ascertaining what the original intent of a particular law might be. The first Congress, made up of those who adopted the United States Constitution, also adopted the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance comes about in 1789. And in this particular Northwest Ordinance, it says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, churches, no, it doesn't say that, schools, and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. You see, the Founding Fathers wanted trans-denominational Christian principles taught in schools. Schools and educational facilities, whether they're financed with tax money or not, is the appropriate venue for these types of things. Of course, we know the story about the Liberty Bell. Going through school, I learned all about the Liberty Bell, the crack on the bell. There's one little fact they didn't tell me, though, the scripture verse on the Liberty Bell. Right, inscribed there on the Liberty Bell is Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 10. Now, are we going to say that the Liberty Bell is unconstitutional? Are we going to say that the Northwest Ordinance suddenly became unconstitutional? So the first Congress, we would have to argue, ended up violating the very principles that they had ratified, adopted, and debated in the Constitution. That's the secularist position. The secularist position is the Founding Fathers laid down this strict wall of separation between church and state. Then they went and violated their own principles. And it wasn't until 200 or so years later that the ACLU was magically dropped from heaven to help us understand what the First Amendment actually means. There's a three-part test that's used. Before I get to that, this is a quote from Joseph Story. Joseph Story served during the Marshall era. He's one of our most prolific Supreme Court writers, and he wrote a very influential book on the Constitution. And notice what he said. Probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and of the amendment to it, now under consideration, the First Amendment, the general, if not universal, sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state. Wow. So far as it was not incompatible with private conscience and the freedom of religious worship. An attempt to level all religions and to make it all a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation, if not universal indignation. So he's saying very clearly that our founders had no problem encouraging Christianity. They never had any attempt to level Christianity. And so what has developed with all of these Establishment Clause cases is a case which develops a three-part test called Lemon versus Kurtzman. In 1971, I like to say lemon is really a lemon because it's brought so much confusion. But whether some kind of Christian practice, whether it be teaching creationism in the schools or whatever, whether it's to be allowed or not, that practice has to pass a three-part test. Number one, the law has to have a secular purpose. Number two, the law must not advance nor inhibit religion. Number three, the law must not excessively entangle government with religion. That's the test that's used based on this strict wall of separation between church and state. Now, I think the John Eidsmoe test is better. It's always a good habit to quote the keynote speaker when you're speaking at an event. But in one of his earlier books, and I didn't see it on his book table because I think it's out of print, this is the first Eidsmoe book I read that really, where he really started to have influence on my thinking, was a book called The Christian Legal Advisor. And he says a better test is any type of religious activity in public life should stand if it doesn't compel attendance at a religious service or activity. We would toss it out if it prefers a particular church or denomination above others, and we would throw it out if it penalizes those who do not support a specific government involvement with religion, such as by depriving them of the right to vote or to hold office. Now, this test that he's devised is far more in harmony with the traditions of our country than is the Lemon test. But number three, the court, in essence, ignored the legislative activities of those who authored the First Amendment. Number four, the fourth problem with the modern judicial use of separation between church and state. Number four, the court applied the First Amendment to the states in spite of the fact that the First Amendment is only a limitation on federal power. The First Amendment itself is not applicable to the states. Now, to understand this, we have to understand how our governing system works. We live in a system of government called federalism. Federalism is the idea that we actually have two layers of government, and even more if you count counties and cities and things of that nature, local governments. But we have at least two layers of government operating over the same geographic expanse. We have the federal government in Washington, D.C., and then we have the individual state governments. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution shows this very clearly. It says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Federalist Paper number 45 puts it this way: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government, that's the national government, are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Now, today it's the exact opposite, isn't it? It's the Fedzilla, as I like to call it, which has the real power. And the state governments are losing power. But this is something that we call federalism. It's a basic tenet of our system, and it really has to do with human nature. It's doubtful that this system could have ever originated if our founders were not steeped in a biblical anthropology or doctrine of man. So Federalist Paper number 51 says, "But what is government but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be ministered by men over men, the greatest difficulty lies in this. You first must enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Founding fathers said, we have a problem here called sin. We got to make the government strong enough to control the sin natures of people, but it's got to be weak enough so that those running the government don't become corrupted. Because after all, at the end of the day, all power tends to corrupt. Lord Acton said, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's biblical anthropology. So what our founding fathers did is they divided power up. They divided it up horizontally amongst the three separate branches. The legislative branch makes law, the executive branch executes law, and the judicial branch interprets law. I think I've heard that somewhere before. There it is, Isaiah 33:22. "For the Lord is our judge," judicial power. "The Lord is our lawgiver," that's legislative power. "The Lord is our king," that is executive power. God expresses himself, it seems to me, through three branches in a certain sense. And so this idea found its way into the thinking of our founding fathers. And the reason that they set up federalism the way they did is this. Mansfield says, when the founding generation of Americans turned to the business of creating a country that they had just fought a war against, and they had fought a war against a centralized and controlling government. They had no intention of creating an American version of the same evil. So that's why the power is divided. Now, a very interesting thing happens when you study the First Amendment. When you study the First Amendment, you see very clearly that the First Amendment is a restraint on national power, not state power. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." John Marshall, in a case called Barron versus Baltimore, says this, "The Constitution was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves, for their own government, and not for the government of the individual states. Therefore, the Bill of Rights contains no expression indicating an intention to apply them to the state governments." So when the Ingle Court and the Schempp Court used this phrase, separation between church and state, they took something in the First Amendment that's not there, and then they secondly violated the First Amendment itself by applying the First Amendment at the state level, when the First Amendment itself is only a limitation on federal power. Now, how in the world could they get away with that? They got away with it because of something called the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was an amendment that was given to give rights to recently emancipated slaves in the post-Civil War era, and that is a limitation on states. And I have all of the underlining there of state. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law. It goes on, nor shall any state deprive any persons of life, liberty, or property. And so what began to happen amongst the various judicial opinions is the Supreme Court started to follow a policy called incorporation, where they began to gradually make the Bill of Rights applicable to the state level through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And the first time that the Establishment Clause became applicable at the state level was in this particular case, Jefferson versus Board of Education, 1947. That case really laid the foundation for what the Ingle and the Schempp courts would do in 1962 and 1963. This is an interesting case that involved a New Jersey law which authorized payment by school boards of the cost of transportation to and from school. And it included parents who sent their children to private schools, religious schools, and Catholic schools. So that was what was going on in New York. And the court actually upheld that particular arrangement. But they, in the process, made a very sweeping statement. And the statement went like this: in the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. The wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. So this language is in case law now, probably about 15 years or so before the Engle courts and the Schempp courts did their thing. And this, in essence, laid the foundation for what was coming. Sweeping language was on the books. Now, the guy who wrote this is a guy named Hugo Black, and I sort of hesitated to bring some of this up because it sounds kind of ad hominem, and it doesn't... But to understand what's going on, you have to understand a little bit about Hugo Black. Hugo Black was challenged for his competency as a jurist. Mansfield says this: his opinions sounded like Senate speeches and were unevenly reasoned. Justice Harlan Fiske Stone complained openly about Black to members of the press and even wrote Felix Frankfurter at Harvard Law School suggesting that he give Black some needed tutoring. It's quite a thing to say about a Supreme Court justice. Something else that's interesting about Hugo Black is he was a former Klansman. He has KKK in his background. Now, we know about the KKK. They basically hate three groups of people: Jews, blacks, and Catholics. And so this might help explain this sweeping language that's on the books in 1947. Why would he make a statement that sweeping? I don't know the man's heart. But perhaps it had to do with this bigotry that he had towards Catholics. But the point I'm trying to make is, number 4, the court applied in 1962 and 1963 the First Amendment to the states in spite of the fact that the First Amendment is only a limitation on federal power. Number 5, the fifth thing the court did is they ignored the original intent of the 14th Amendment. What does the 14th Amendment have to do with religion? Absolutely nothing. The Engle and Schempp courts used the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment as a vehicle for bringing the Establishment Clause down to the state level. Now, when you study the 14th Amendment, the only thing the 14th Amendment deals with is the rights of recently emancipated slaves. In fact, when you study this very carefully, and I have the court case cited there in the paper, you discover something very interesting called the Blaine Amendment, proposed by Representative Blaine of Maine 7 years after the after the legislature adopted the 14th Amendment. And it's very interesting that the Congress, comprised of the exact same people who had debated, discussed, ratified, adopted the 14th Amendment, turned down the Blaine Amendment. The Blaine Amendment was trying to link the First Amendment with the 14th Amendment to make the First Amendment applicable to the states. And those who knew the 14th Amendment the best said that's not a good idea, and they turned it down. So Justice Learned Hand, years later in a case, says this: the Blaine Amendment's defeat was a stark testimony to the fact that the adopters of the 14th Amendment never intended to incorporate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment against the states. So what happened in 1962 and 1963 is catastrophic, because the court completely ignored the context of the 14th Amendment, which is a provision for recently emancipated slaves, nothing to do with religion. And those that knew the 14th Amendment best rejected legislatively the idea that the First Amendment should be made applicable to the states through the vehicle of the 14th Amendment. Well, cheer up, it's about to get a little bit worse. Number 6, When the court made these decisions in 1962 and 1963, they failed to cite a single precedent. No precedent is cited in the Engel case or the Schempp case. Now, what is precedent? Precedent is basically what previous courts have done with a similar set of facts. Lawyers that are worth their salt come before a court and they try to argue their case based on what previous courts have done with a similar set of facts, because there's an ancient principle in the law called stare decisis, which is a Latin expression which says, let precedent stand. In other words, a good jurist does not want to overturn precedent. And they don't want to do that unless there's very good reason to, but they don't want to do that because it causes a lot of confusion in society. It interrupts stability, the normalcy of business relationships, and those types of things. And yet the Schempp court in 1963, looking back at the Engel court in 1962, made this statement. They said, finally, in Engel v. Vital, now that's the case where the separation of church and state is used legally for the first time. Finally, in Engel v. Vital, only last year, these principles, now that's the separation of church and state principles, these principles were so universally recognized that the court, without the citation of a single case, reaffirmed them. It's a funny thing that happens in the area of law. I've watched it happen for years in academia. One PhD will say something, and then a second PhD will quote the first PhD, and suddenly this thing, whatever the first PhD said, becomes true. It starts getting quoted by everybody. Well, did the first PhD have his facts right? Well, nobody really questions that. They just buy into this idea because it's what something has been established. Well, the same type of thing is happening with these separation of church and state cases. One court will say something, and then another court will quote or cite that first court, and suddenly this idea, the strict wall of separation of church and state, becomes true. You don't need to cite any precedents anymore because you've got precedent. The precedent you just made up. And so this chart here is very interesting because what it shows is that subsequent courts, when dealing with the separation of church and state issue, rarely go back to anything prior to 1947. Because 1947 is when the Establishment Clause is made applicable to the states and the separation of church and state is introduced into the Establishment Clause. So in the left column, you see the case name. Then as you move to the right, you see the date. And as you keep moving to the right, you see prior citations prior to 1947. And then as you keep moving, you see post-1947 citations. So Levitt versus Committee, 1973, another case dealing with the separation of church and state. 0 pre-1947 citations. 18 post-1947 citations. Committee versus Nyquist, 1973. 1 pre-1947 citation. 99 post-1947 citations. Stone versus Graham. Now, Stone versus Graham is where the court came in and said you can't post the Ten Commandments on a schoolhouse wall. 0 pre-1947 citations. 9 post-1947 citations. Marsh versus Chambers, 1982. 1 pre-1947 citation. 32 post-1947 citations. When I was in the law school, and they had us study constitutional law, and we got to the cases in the casebook that deal with the Establishment Clause. The very first case they had us read was in 1947. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of strange. I mean, did we just have the American Revolution and then just fast forward it to 1947? What about everything in between? And you see, that is the scenario that we find ourselves. Most lawyers don't know anything about this issue prior to 1947. That is a section of history that's basically been erased from the thinking of judges, the thinking of philosophers, the thinking of politicians, and so forth. And basically, this is how Roe versus Wade became reality in our country. The court in 1973 found in the text of the Constitution the right to procure an abortion. I've read the Constitution before. I don't see it in there. Well, they said it's in and this is no joke, the penumbras. I had to go look that word up when they told me what is a penumbra. You look it up in a dictionary, it's a shadow. The shadow casts, a certain way, and you can kind of see in the shadows they're lurking this right to procure an abortion. And so what do subsequent courts do now that this precedent has been established? They all cite the Roe Court, but they don't cite anything before 1973. It's one of the most humorous things to me to watch is a Republican president appointing a conservative member of the judiciary like Clarence Thomas or Robert Bork or somebody like that, and seeing them come before liberal senators for questioning. And they ask the conservative jurist, are you going to respect settled law? And what they mean by that is, are you going to respect Roe? Are you going to respect the separation of church and state decisions? When Roe versus Wade itself had no respect for settled law. The Roe Court demolished settled law. The Engel and Schempp courts demolished settled law. But now that their precedent has been established, whether it's separation of church and state or the right to procure an abortion, now all of a sudden the left, the Ted Kennedys of the world, are all worried about settled law. So it's a very fascinating game that's being played here as you study this. Number seven. The seventh problem with the modern judicial use of separation between church and state. Number 7, the court erroneously believed that Bible reading causes psychological damage. I told you it was going to get worse. Now, this is a perspective that we call a priori reasoning. A priori reasoning basically means that you decide your conclusion ahead of time. And then you go into the facts and you make the facts fit. If you've got to take them out of context, you make the facts fit. If you talk to a very good criminal investigator, they will tell you that they try not to develop a theory on their case, who done it, who's the bad guy. They try not to develop that theory too early. Because the basic temptation is they're going to develop a theory on the case, then they're going to try to make the facts fit what they think the outcome should be. So they try to be as objective and as possible. And that's good legal thought. That's good scholarship. Don't rush in with a conclusion and try to make everything fit your conclusion. Let's let the evidence say what it's going to say first and develop our conclusion second, or else we are in danger of a priori reasoning. But the court, I believe, in 1962 and 1963 engaged in a priori reasoning because ahead of time they had already made up their minds that Bible reading and prayer is psychologically damaging. And this is an actual quote from the case. It says, but if portions of the New Testament were read, now this is talking about reading portions of the New Testament in front of school children. If portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be, in his specific experience with children, Dr. Grazel observes, had been psychologically harmful to the child. Well, heck, if I already believe that about the Bible, before I even come to analyzing whether this violates the Establishment Clause or not, I'm going to get the Bible out because I've made up my mind that the Bible is damaging. And so our Supreme Court had that in their minds, I believe, even before they began to reason legally. It's very interesting to me, this issue about the Bible being psychologically damaging. I personally have found the Bible more psychologically helpful than any other book I've ever read. Problems related to worry or anxiety, you can go right to Matthew 6, verses 25 through 33, and anxiety is cured. Problems related to bitterness and anger, the Bible has the answer to that. Problems related to a shaky self-image, the Bible has the answer to that. We're made in God's image. So why can't we hear some testimony about the Bible being psychologically helpful? Why is it just one-sided? The Bible reading can be psychologically damaging, and then try to get the Bible out of the school because of an a priori mindset. Number 8. The 8th problem with the modern judicial use of separation between church and state, 1962, 1963, is the Supreme Court acted as the Constitution's amender rather than its interpreter. In other words, the Supreme Court pursued a legislative rather than a judicial philosophy. Now, we all know about the separation of powers. We have a judicial branch, an executive branch, and a legislative branch. The legislative branch makes law. The judicial branch interprets the law. And when the judicial branch begins to add things to the Constitution that aren't there, they are taking on a legislative role. And we have, as a result, a separation of powers crisis. George Washington told us the procedure that was to take place to change the wording of the Constitution. He says, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of constitutional powers be at any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment, the way the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation. Though this may, in one instance, be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. What happens when the judicial branch of government assumes a legislative function? Basically, what happens is you have a scenario developing where you may agree with what they do, but the next time around, you may not agree with what they do. It places this awesome power in the hands of the court, and members of the federal judiciary are appointed for life. If I don't like the way they've amended it, I have no recourse against them through the ballot box. But if my elected representatives amend the document, that's different, because I can vote against them in the next election cycle. It's very interesting to me that in the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 78, the judicial branch of government was called the least dangerous branch of government. The Federalist Papers were written in the public newspapers to those in New York for farmers. John Eidsmoe talks about how his students complain that they make him read, that he makes them read the Federalist Papers because they're so scholarly. And he says, actually, those were written for the farmers. Shows you how our educational knowledge has gone down. But the Federalist Paper number 78, in essence, says that the judicial branch of government is the least dangerous branch. Those that were thinking about ratifying the Constitution were told, don't worry about the judicial branch. It's not going to bother you at all. And what has happened over time is the least dangerous branch has become the most dangerous branch. So the judges assumed a legislative role. Now, David Barton, I think, makes a very interesting point. He talks about the backgrounds of those who ushered in this decision. He says, for example, Chief Justice Earl Warren had been the governor of California for 10 years prior to his appointment to the court. Justice Hugo Black had been a U.S. Senator for 10 years prior to his appointment to the court. Justice Felix Frankfurter had been an assistant to the Secretary of Labor and a founding member of the ACLU. That alone should have disqualified him. Justice Arthur Goldberg had been the Secretary of Labor and an ambassador to the United Nations. Justice William Douglas was chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. All of the justices except Potter Stewart had similar political backgrounds. Justice Potter Stewart, having been a federal judge for 4 years prior to his appointment, was the only member of the court with extended federal constitutional experience before his appointment. Interestingly, Justice Potter Stewart was the only justice who objected to the removal of prayer on the basis of precedent. He alone acted as judge. The rest acted as politicians. So what he is doing is he is showing that all of these people that made these decisions in 1962 and 1963 had extended experience in the other arms of government, whether it be executive or legislative. And when they got onto the court, they kept acting like they were still in the executive and legislative branch. They didn't realize they're in a branch of government that's supposed to interpret, not to make law. And that explains how the court moved in more of this legislative philosophy. So we are in an age of time that I like to call the oligarchical age. You know what the word oligos means from your study of Greek. It means small or few. It means being ruled by a small or a few number of people. All you need are 5 votes to change the Constitution. It doesn't have to go through an amendment process at all. In fact, there's a famous quip during the Warren years. It says, with 5 votes, we can do anything. And that, in essence, is what has happened. Number 9, and with this we're finished. Number 9. Ninth problem with modern judicial use of separation between church and state. The court selectively applied their newly created separation of church and state doctrine exclusively to the Judeo-Christian value system, while simultaneously giving other non-Christian religions a virtual free pass. In other words, what we're talking about here is selective enforcement. And one of the great truths of philosophy that we learn is nature abhors a vacuum. If one value system is removed from the public square doesn't stay neutral. The schools don't stay neutral. Another value system quickly fills its place. So, prayer and Bible reading, the Judeo-Christian value system is pushed out of the schools, and what starts to fill the void? Pagan practices. And suddenly the court, with this doctrine of separation between church and state that they created, turn a deaf ear to disestablishing those pagan practices. Here's John Dunphy, a New Ager. He says, I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classrooms by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call the divinity in every human being. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers. What he is saying is we're going to use the public schools to teach a new doctrine. So out goes Christianity, in comes the New Age movement, in comes Islam. In the wake of September 11th, an increasing number of California public school students must attend an intensive 3-week course on Islam, reports Assist News Service. The course mandates that 7th graders learn the tenets of Islam, study the important figures of the faith, wear a robe, adopt a Muslim name, stage their own jihad. I don't know how that works exactly. Students must memorize many verses from the Quran. They're taught to pray in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, are instructed to chant, praise Allah, the Lord of creation. We can never teach Christianity like this, one outraged parent told ANS. We couldn't even mention the name of Jesus in public schools, but they teach Islam as the true religion, and students are taught about Islam and how to pray to Allah. Could you imagine the barrage and problems we would have from the ACLU if Christianity were taught in the public schools, and if we tried to teach about the contributions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the Apostle Paul? But when it comes to furthering Islamic religion in public schools, there is not word from the ACLU, People for the American Way, or anybody else. This is hypocrisy. Christianity goes out, and what places it? Islam, the New Age movement. Liberal Christianity comes in. It's very interesting to me that the phrase separation of church and state is only applied to the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons of the world. What about Al Sharpton? Jesse Jackson, Tony Campolo, Jim Wallace, Jeremiah Wright, Louis Farrakhan. Are they not espousing some form of religion? How come the separation of church and state doesn't apply to them? I remember when universal Obamacare passed. Nancy Pelosi was giving a speech. I was watching her on C-SPAN, and she said, "The Word of God has been made flesh." Quoting John 1:14. Is she not mixing Christianity with religion to promote her perspective? Liberal Christianity comes in, humanism comes in. You really need to read Humanist Manifesto 2000. It's the third document that the humanists have created, and you need to read it because it articulates the belief system that is dominating the United States of America today. Walter Mondale's brother, is a signatory to the Humanist Manifesto, as are many others. Humanists believe in the non-existence or irrelevancy of God. Man is the center of all things. The reality of evolution. Man is an evolved animal rather than a special creature made in the image of his Creator. The absence of any morals or values of an absolute form. Confidence in the scientific method to solve the world's problems. The Bible answers the fundamental questions of life. Who am I? A special creation of God. Where did I come from? From God's design. Why am I here? To know and glorify God. Where am I going? To heaven. How can I get there? Only through Jesus Christ. Humanists answer those same questions. Who am I? A biological accident. So you've gone from the goo to the zoo to you. Where did I come from? From the primordial soup. Why am I here? To fulfill self. Where am I going? Towards a planetary new world order. How do I get there? The scientific method. See, and it's interesting, as you read Humanist Manifesto 2000, they'll tell you they're a religion. They use phrases like advancement of religion, religious humanists, religious humanism. Norm Geisler, the well-known Christian apologist who you all know, was put on the stand as an expert witness in 1982, I believe it was, in a case dealing with whether creationism should be taught alongside evolution in the school. And Dr. Geisler's legal transcript is available in one of his recently released books. I have it quoted down there at the bottom. But he was asked the question, is humanism a religion? And he goes on explaining why humanism is as much a religion as is Christianity. You might remember when David Noble was here at this very conference some years back, he told us that the American Humanist Society has tax-exempt 501c3 status, which is what your church most likely has. And yet they can teach their doctrine in the schools. We cannot teach our doctrine in the schools. The Supreme Court in 1961, in a case called Torcaso versus Watkins, acknowledged that humanism is a religion. It says, among the religions in the world which do not teach that what would generally be considered a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others. Public schools have become seminaries in a certain sense, promoting the next generation into a new line of thinking. The humanists told us they were going to do this with the public schools. This is a humanist all the way back in 1930. He says, education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday school teachers meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? And we wonder why we're losing the next generation for Christ. My big problem with the separation between church and state idea is it's never applied in a neutral fashion. It was used to banish Christianity from the public square. It was used to injure Christianity, but it was never equally applied to these other doctrines. The public schools are as religious as ever, teaching humanism masquerading as neutrality. A doctrine is invented out of thin air. It's applied exclusively to Christianity. The country shifts, and then suddenly nobody talks about the doctrine anymore. It's very similar to the way people talk about feminism today. You hear the left all of the time talking about feminism. But then when Bill Clinton rapes, gropes, and molests multiple women, all of these feminist organizations are silent. That sort of shows me that they're really not interested in feminism. What they're interested is in using feminism to advance an agenda. That is, in essence, how I see the separation of church and state transpiring. In review, we've learned that the separation of church and state is out of whack with the our Constitution because the court read words into the First Amendment that simply are not there. They relied upon and took out of context a letter written by Thomas Jefferson more than a decade after the Constitution was created. They ignored the legislative activities of those who authored the First Amendment. They applied the First Amendment to the states in spite of the fact that the First Amendment describes itself as only a limitation on federal power. They ignored the original intent of the 14th Amendment. They failed to cite a single precedent. They erroneously believed that Christianity causes psychological damage. They acted as the Constitution's amender rather than its interpreter. And then they selectively applied their newly created separation doctrine to the Judeo-Christian truth exclusively while giving alternative non-Christian religions a virtual free pass. You say, wow, Andy, that's a harsh critique. It's not mine alone. Chief Justice Rehnquist, the former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Wallace versus Jaffrey, says this about the separation of church and state. Look at these expressions. The absence of any historical basis for this rigid theory of separation, not wholly accurate, can only be dimly perceived. Its lack of historical support, all but useless as a guide to sound constitutional application. It illustrates all too well Benjamin Cardozo's observation that metaphors in law are to be narrowly watched, for starting as devices to liberate thought, they often end up in enslaving it. A mischievous diversion of judges from the actual intentions of the drafters of the Bill of Rights. No amount of repetition of historical errors and judicial opinions can make these errors true. A metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor which has proved useless as a guide to judging, it should frankly and explicitly be abandoned. Not quoting Pat Robertson there. One quick point, and with this I am finished. All of this, it would be easier for me to stomach if there was some sort of national vote on it. I mean, if an amendment was passed where we all had a say, where we wanted to ban Christianity from the public square, I would be fine with it. But this did not come into our culture through the legislative arm of government. It came into our culture through the judicial branch of government. It is very interesting to me to note that the very same voices that cry out repeatedly for a separation between church and state are the same voices that want to make the government bigger and bigger and bigger. Let's think about that for just a second. If government and religion don't mix, if Christianity is to be banned from government, and then at the same time the government has to grow so that it intrudes into every area of our lives, are they not designing a country and a culture without God? And Coulter puts it this way. First they claim there is no place for religion in the public square, and then they expand the public square to include everything. That's why we need to carefully monitor this idea of separation between church and state, lest our national motto be not freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. Persecution and difficult times are coming, I believe, to America, and this is why we need an awareness of these legal doctrines. And I'm finished.
All right, I'm going to ask the first question. We've got 3 minutes for Q&A, and since I'm running the show, I get to ask the question.
It's good to be the king.
That's right. It's good to be king. I get to say that once every year. Okay. This is great information, Andy, but it's just information. Now, I want to know, what's the action plan? What are we to do with this? And especially as pastors and leaders, what should the action plan be on the basis of truth?
Well, I would say recognize the power of the judiciary and tell people when they vote that that's a key question that they need to ask. What is the judicial philosophy of the president or the senator? Because they're going to control what kind of people are on the court. So that would be the obvious thing.
Get out of the ivory tower. What are we supposed to? What are we supposed to do? I mean, should we just go home, fold our hands, and pray about it? Should we write letters to congressmen? Should we write letters to people we know in the legal field? What should we do?
Well,
should we teach this to our congregations?
All of the above. All of the above. One thing is to think about impeachment. Sorry to bring that up. Something else to do is education. We need to start our own schools and conferences like this.
I'm just giving you
a hard time.
What do you mean think about?
Okay.
What do you mean think about? I'm asking for concrete, that's what, because we all tend to do this. Oh, well, this is nice, this is good, and I'm trying to pull you out of the abstract. I do this to myself. We tend to produce these really great, this is the way it is, but what is a specific 3 points we can go do this next week to start implementing some action against the trend where we're doing specific hardcore, not just thinking about it. Think about it. Think about impeachment. Some of us dream about impeachment. Okay, but what do we do? I mean, okay? That's what I'm saying. So think about that while I'm walking back there.
All right, I'm going to take the fifth on that then, I guess.
No, I don't mean about that specifically, but just some concrete ideas about what we can do in terms of involvement, communicating with congressmen, senators. One of the things I think that for example, we're going to have the APAC guy here later, but I've gone the last 3 or 4 years, and I didn't do it the first year, but they lobby their congressmen every year. And I'm going to some of these even because the congressman we have in this district, Culberson, is really solid. But I want him to associate my name with my face so that when I send him an email, he knows who it is that's sending him an email. So that when I say something or suggest something, encourage him, tell him I'm praying for him, recommending a course of action, he's going to know who that's coming from. Yeah. How many people, and I want to show of hands, how many people here have ever written their congressman, have ever been to his office, are known by him by face or by name? These guys really need to know that. That's great. I'm glad to see that show of hands. And you did it. I didn't want to see it, but you did it. That's great. But that's what we need to do.
Well, Andy, what about the 10th Amendment nullification packet that I gave you about a year ago? Mm-hmm. We need to learn about the Jeffersonian thinking as far as the resolutions of Virginia and Kentucky of 1798 and 1799, in which he spelled out the constitutional tool whereby the states step up. It's called interposition or intervening. And the states cannot repeal or revoke a rule that has been put into force by any branch of the federal government. But the one thing they can do is disobey, refuse to enforce, refuse to implement. And that is called nullification. And there's an excellent book on that topic written by maybe your namesake, Thomas E. Woods.
No relation,
no. No, okay. Well, anyhow, I've spent many hours studying that, and pardon me, it is complete with about 11 documents from 1798 to 1859, declaring that very issue.
And also becoming aware of that Mac Prince case that you brought to our attention.
That question on nullification we ought to save for, I'll try to jot a note on that, so I'll ask that question on the panel, please, for John to handle during the panel.
Do you think it's possible for the government to yank the church's 501c3 status, and what would happen to churches if that happened?
Yeah, that was something that came up yesterday. I think, is it possible? I think it's possible for this government to do anything. And I think one of the issues that came up is some churches are no longer taking the 501c3 exemption. I think you brought that up, didn't you?
Yeah, some of us never
took it in the first place.
What really surprised me was that was a position that most conservative churches took. Bible churches were taking it up through the time when I was ordained in the early 80s, and I was really stunned over the last 20 years in learning about some conservative churches that didn't even raise a question about that. So, Russ, you'll be the last question, and then we'll take our break.
Actually, I'm going to make a suggestion. I'll tell you one practical thing I think we can all do, and that's take our kids out of public schools and start private schools and homeschool them.
Well, I think that's a good suggestion. One of the great problems we see today is the number of parents whose kids leave home, come home 6 months later, and have rejected, completely flipped on everything that they were taught. And I've seen this happen even with kids who were, what's the book that Already Gone? Yeah, and I read that, and that really applies to a lot of evangelical churches. I think a lot of the structures that they talk about implementing, we've implemented. Other Bible churches, maybe like many of y'all have implemented that. You don't really fit that mold. Nevertheless, even with, I know parents that have done everything I can think of a parent should do, and it still happens. It's just, there's a lot of poison in the water that our whole culture is drinking right now.
This government is dictating private schools and private citizens.
Sure, it is. Let's break. We'll have a 20-minute break. Jeff Adicott will be here. He's the director of the Center for Terrorism Law at St. Mary's. You do not want to miss that or anything else today whatsoever. Let's take our break.